Been hunting with a bow on the same 40 acres near Clarion, Pennsylvania for 31 years. My grandfather bought that land. My father hunted it before me. Now it's mine. I know every deer trail on that property, every scrape, every rub line, every spot where the does bed down by the second week of October. I know the location of every tree stand because I built every single one of them. 7 stands, and I can walk to any of them in the dark without a flashlight, which I've done more times than I can count. I say all of that because I need you to understand where I'm coming from. I'm not someone who spooks easy. I don't imagine things. I've been alone on that land in every kind of weather and darkness since I was a teenager, and not once in 31 years did I feel like something was wrong out there. That changed last November, during the first week of bow season, and it started with a man I couldn't explain. I hunt alone. My brother Phil used to come up every year, but he moved to Florida 6 years back and rarely makes the trip anymore. My nephew Jake has standing permission, but he works construction, and opening week, he's always tied to a job. So when I climbed into my south stand before first light on opening morning, there wasn't supposed to be another person on those 40 acres. The property is posted, has been for 15 years. New signs went up in August. The first morning was quiet. A doe worked through around 9, too young to take. I passed on her and settled back in to wait. It was around 11:30 when I caught movement to the south, a flash of orange moving through the oaks below the ridge. My first thought was that Jake had gotten the day off and hadn't called ahead. He's done that before. But the way the man was moving wasn't right. A hunter moves slow, stops constantly, checks the wind, checks his feet, watches the ground in front of him. This man walked at a steady, even pace through my timber like he was crossing a parking lot, not scanning for deer sign, not glassing anything, just walking parallel to the ridge, calm and unhurried, until he cleared the south woodlot and disappeared into the tree line. I watched him go and told myself he was a trespasser, a hiker who hadn't seen the posted signs or hadn't cared about them. We get that on the south end sometimes because there's no road access to put up a physical gate. I made a note to talk to him if I saw him again, and I let it go. Day 2, I was back in the same stand, same setup. Around 11 in the morning, I looked south. He was there again, standing at the edge of the south woodlot in almost the exact same spot where I'd last seen him the day before. Not walking this time, standing, and he was facing my stand. Any hunter knows the etiquette. If you spot another guy in the woods, you look away. You give him his space. You don't stand there and stare at his position because you don't want to blow his hunt. This man did none of that. He stood at the edge of those trees with his face turned up toward me, and he didn't move. I don't know exactly how long it was. Long enough that I started counting. When I got to 40, I stopped counting and just watched him back. Then he turned and walked into the woods. Day 3, I switched to the North Ridge stand on the opposite end of the property. I figured if he came back, he'd go to the south end again, and I'd have the whole 40 acres between us. I was up before light, watched a good buck work through at sunrise. Didn't have a shot. By 9 o'clock, I climbed down to check the scrape at the base of the tree. There was a cigarette butt on the rung of the ladder, tucked right into the angle of the metal. I don't smoke. Phil doesn't smoke. Jake doesn't smoke. That stand isn't visible from any road, any neighboring property, or any public land. The only way to reach it is on a trail that runs through the middle of my 40 acres from the south end. Someone had been there at the base of that stand, or up in it, recently enough that the cigarette was still mostly intact. I called Jake that afternoon. He hadn't been out. He said the forecast looked rough and he was waiting for the weekend. I didn't say anything about the cigarette. I didn't know how to say it without sounding like something was wrong with me. Day 4, I went back to the south stand because I wanted to see that woodlot from the high position. I was up in it before first light. When it got gray enough to see, I looked down at the platform. There was a thermos sitting on the far corner of it. Stainless steel, no markings, no name on it. I reached over and picked it up. It was warm, not room temperature warm. Warm the way something is warm when it's been held in someone's hands recently. I had not brought a thermos that morning. I hadn't brought one any morning that week. I sat there with that thermos in both hands and went through every possibility I could think of. Jake had lied and come out. Bill had flown up and surprised me. I had somehow left it there on a previous trip and forgotten. Each of those explanations died before I finished thinking it through. That stand had been empty since I'd climbed out of it the evening before. I put the thermos back, I climbed down, I spent 2 hours walking the south woodlot until I found what I was looking for. A flat patch of ground cover pressed down into the shape of a person lying prone facing the direction of my stand. The grass was still bent. Whoever had been there, the morning wasn't old yet. I went home and didn't tell my wife. She asked if the deer were moving, and I said they weren't. Day 5, I almost didn't go. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes before I started it. That land has been in my family for 50 years. My grandfather cleared the south woodlot by hand. I was not going to let some stranger who wouldn't show his face make me feel like I didn't belong on it. I was in the south stand by 5:30. Light came up slow, gray and flat, the way it gets in Pennsylvania in early November when the clouds have been sitting for 3 days. He came out of the south woodlot at around 8 o'clock, same orange jacket, same steady pace. He walked to the edge of the open ground between the woodlot and my stand, and he stopped, 20 yards. That's inside bow range. Anyone who hunts knows what 20 yards means when you're in a tree stand. He knew exactly where he was standing. He looked up at me and raised his right hand in a wave, held it there for a long moment. Then he lowered his hand, pressed 2 fingers against his own chest, and pointed them at me. I had an arrow nocked. I didn't raise the bow. I don't know why. There was no good reason not to. Nothing stopping me, but I didn't. We looked at each other for what felt like half a minute, and then he turned and walked back into the south woodlot like he just checked something off a list. I was out of that stand in under a minute. I walked to my truck, got in, and sat there with the engine off. I called my neighbor Marv, who farms the land to the south. He said he hadn't seen anyone cutting through his fields. He asked if I wanted company. I said no. Day 6, I stayed on the north end. I wasn't going back to the south stand. I checked the trail camera I'd had strapped to an oak on the north ridge for 2 years, the one I usually don't bother pulling until the end of season. The card had 214 photos on it. About 60 were deer. The remaining 154 were all taken in the 4 to 6 a.m. window, before first light, every morning that week. Every one of those photos showed the same man in orange, standing directly in front of the camera and facing the lens, not walking through the frame, not caught mid-stride, facing it, standing close enough that his face filled most of the image. In every single frame, he had the same expression, patient, waiting, like he'd been standing there long enough to be comfortable. He knew where every camera on that property was. He had gotten to each one in the dark before I arrived and stood in front of it. He had been in my stands before I climbed into them. He had been lying in the south woodlot watching my stand from the ground for 6 consecutive days. I pulled every camera on the property and haven't put them back. I haven't hunted those 40 acres since last November. Bill called a few weeks ago asking about opening week this fall. I told him the deer population had been rough and it probably wasn't worth his time. The thermos is still in a paper bag in my garage. I can't tell you why I kept it. Every time I think about throwing it away, I don't. The part I keep coming back to, the part I still don't have an answer for, is the gesture on day 5. 2 fingers to his chest, then pointing at me. I've thought about it every single day since. I know what it looked like. I know what I'd say it meant if I'd seen someone do it in a different context. I just can't bring myself to say it out loud. All I know is that whoever he was, he moved around those 40 acres like he knew them as well as I did. And I've been hunting that land for 31 years. I keep 12 goats on a 6-acre homestead in Addison County, Vermont. I've had them for 3 years, since the spring after my partner David died, because someone told me that having something that needed you every day was the best thing you could do when you didn't want to get out of bed in the morning. They were right. Goats are creatures of habit. You might hear otherwise, but in my experience, they want the same thing at the same time every day. By dusk, they're at the barn door before I even call them. 3 years running, I know their routine better than I know my own. I'm telling you this because last Thursday, not a single one of them would step inside. I noticed it at around 6:15, same time I always close them in for the night. I walked up from the house and all 12 were clustered at the barn door, but none of them were going through it. They weren't spooked the way goats get when there's a predator scent nearby. No stamping, no alarm calls. They were just standing there, close together, all of them facing the dark inside the barn. I walked past them, pulled the door all the way open, and went in with my flashlight. Nothing. Hay in the feeders, water topped off, everything the same as I'd left it that morning. I walked the whole length of the barn, checked the loft ladder, checked the back stall. Nothing out of place. My best guess was a smell I couldn't detect. A fox had gotten in the week before, and even after I'd cleaned everything, they'd been skittish for a couple of days. Animals hold on to those things longer than we do. I went back out and physically led each goat through the door myself. It took 15 minutes, which is 14 and a half minutes longer than it ever has before. That night, they didn't eat. They stood at the far end of the barn in a group, which they only do when something is wrong. I checked the loft again before I went in. Empty. Friday morning, I was up at 5:30 like always. I do the morning check before coffee. Water, grain, quick walkthrough. When I climbed the loft ladder to throw down hay, I stopped at the top. The hay was disturbed. There's a section at the far end where I keep the loose bales stacked, and in front of them the hay on the floor had been pressed down flat. Not spread around, not rustled the way it gets when a barn cat nests in it. Flattened down into a shape about the size and length of a person lying on their side. The hay at what would have been the head end was compressed deeper, like something heavy had rested there for a while. I stood at the top of that ladder for a long time before I climbed back down. That afternoon, I called my neighbor Carol, who has the dairy farm about 3/4 of a mile up the road. I asked if she'd seen anyone walking the back fields lately, or any vehicles parked on the access road. She said no, nothing unusual. I didn't explain why I was asking. Friday night was the same as Thursday, goats at the door, none going in. I checked the loft before I tried to bring them in, and I found nothing. No new disturbance, no footprints in the hay dust. I brought the goats in, closed the door, and went back to the house. Woke up at 2 in the morning and lay there listening. The only sound I could make out from outside was wind. I almost convinced myself I was wrong about the hay. Almost. Saturday morning, I was at the barn by 5:15. The light was still gray when I opened the door, and I smelled something before I saw anything. Something that didn't belong. Not an animal smell. More like the cold and wood smoke you carry on a coat when you've been outside for a long time. I reached for the light switch. Before I got to it, I heard something from up in the loft. Not a dramatic sound, just the small, faint shift of weight that old hay makes when something changes position on it. I did not go up the ladder that morning. I went back to the house, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table until it was light enough outside that I felt comfortable calling someone. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. A deputy came out around 8, walked the barn, found the flat section in the hay, found what he said looked like partial boot prints in the dust near the loft access, and told me they were probably from a transient looking for somewhere to sleep. He said it happened more than people thought, especially on remote properties in the shoulder season. He said to keep the barn secured at night and to call if anything else came up. I started padlocking the barn door that same morning. I told myself the hay, the footprints, the sounds, all of it was explainable. A person, a stranger, probably gone now that the door was locked. I'm telling you what changed my mind. Sunday evening, I walked up to bring the goats in, and on the hook beside the barn door, the old iron hook where David always hung his winter jacket so he could grab it on the way out for early morning chores. There was a jacket, David's jacket. David's jacket is in a box in the closet upstairs where it's been since he died. I have not taken it out in 2 years. I know exactly where it is. This was his jacket, the one from the box. The dark green Carhartt with the tear on the left elbow where he caught it on a fence wire the winter before he got sick, and the collar turned up on the right side the way he always wore it. I stood in front of that hook and looked at that jacket for a long time without touching it. The goats were somewhere behind me. I wasn't thinking about them. The inside of the collar has his name written in black marker. I know because I put it there myself years ago so it wouldn't get confused at the feed store when we'd all leave our coats at the door. I turned the collar over with 2 fingers. His name, his handwriting, but I was the one who wrote it. And underneath his name, in handwriting that was not mine, and had not been there before. A date, last Tuesday. I don't know who was in my barn. I don't know how they got that jacket out of a box inside my locked house or what they wanted me to understand by hanging it there. The sheriff's deputy came back, took photos, took the jacket. He said they'd look into it. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard anything since. The goats go into the barn on their own again now. Whatever was in there, it hasn't been back. Or if it has, I haven't found evidence of it. The thing I can't let go of, the detail I keep turning over, is the date, Tuesday. The night I woke up at 2 a.m. and lay there listening to the wind, the same night I told myself nothing was wrong. I need to start by telling you what my job actually involves, because it matters. I'm a backcountry ranger for a remote sector of a national park in western Colorado. My station sits at about 9,000 feet elevation, and in shoulder season, late September through October, I'm the only full-time presence in a 12-mile radius. The nearest town is 65 road miles away. There's no cell service at the station. The radio is my connection to the outside world, and on a slow day it stays quiet for 8-10 hours at a stretch. I've done this work for 4 years. I'm trained to stay calm, to observe accurately, and to document what I see without editorializing. I write incident reports. I assess situations. I do not get rattled by things I can't immediately explain, because in this job, you encounter things you can't immediately explain all the time. Unusual animal behavior, equipment failures, people who shouldn't be where they are. You note them and you follow protocol. I'm telling you all of that because I want you to understand what it cost me to feel as unsettled as I did after a single conversation with a woman I'd never seen before. She walked up to the station at dusk on a Thursday in late October. I saw her coming up the access trail from the south about 100 yards out, and I watched her the whole way because hikers don't come to my station at dusk in October. The park is at skeleton crew visitation, and anyone that far back in the backcountry at that hour is either finishing a long route or lost. She was neither, as far as I could tell. She was a woman, mid-40s, well-dressed, not hiking clothes, dark blazer, dark slacks, leather shoes that were not made for a rocky trail. She was carrying nothing, no pack, no water bottle, no jacket, despite the temperature being in the low 40s. She asked me how to get to Hayden. Hayden, Colorado is a town in Routt County. It is 93 miles from my station by road. The nearest trailhead to my station is 12 miles away. There is no route from where I was standing that leads to Hayden by foot in any reasonable time frame. I asked her where she'd parked. She said she hadn't driven. I asked how she'd gotten to the trail. She didn't answer that question. She said she thought if she could just get to the main road, she'd be fine from there. I told her the closest trailhead was 12 miles out, that it would be fully dark in 40 minutes, that she didn't have the right gear for the temperature, and that her best option was to stay at the station overnight, and I'd radio for someone to come out in the morning. She thanked me but said no. She said she'd wait. I asked what she meant by wait. She said she'd wait outside, that someone was coming to get her. I told her it would be a long wait and that she was welcome to come inside. She said no thank you, and she walked to the picnic bench outside the south window and sat down. That was at 6:42 in the evening. I went back inside and did my end-of-day checks. At 7:15, I looked out the south window. She was sitting in exactly the same position she'd been in when she sat down, hands in her lap, back straight, facing the station door. At 8, I turned on the exterior camera feeds on my laptop. We have two, one covering the south approach and one covering the north, both motion activated. I pulled up the live feed for the south camera. She was sitting at the picnic bench with her face angled toward the door. I zoomed in on the feed to get a clearer image. I watched it for 2 or 3 minutes. She wasn't blinking. I know how that sounds, but I watched the feed for at least 3 minutes, and her eyes didn't close once. She was just sitting there in the exterior light with her eyes open and her face turned toward the station, not blinking, not moving. At 9, I went out to check on her. She was gone. The bench was empty. No tracks going north, none going south. The gravel around the bench holds impressions well. We use it to document animal activity. And there were the impressions from her shoes when she'd sat down and nothing indicating how she'd left. The bench was warm. I put my hand on it, and it was warm in the way that something is warm after a person has been sitting on it for a long time. I radioed my sector chief and filed a report. He said he'd have someone check the south trailhead for an unattended vehicle in the morning. Nothing was found. I'll tell you the part that I documented, and then I'll tell you the part I didn't. What I documented. The following morning, I pulled the exterior camera footage from the previous night. At 9:14 p.m., roughly the time I'd gone outside to check on her, the footage showed her standing up from the bench, walking directly to the station door and stepping out of frame. Not toward the trail, toward the door. The door camera showed nothing. The door never opened. She doesn't appear anywhere in the north camera feed. What I didn't put in the report, I reviewed that footage frame by frame. There is one frame, a single frame, around 6 frames per second, so we're talking about a fraction of a second, in which the woman is visible inside the station, standing behind my desk chair, facing the camera. One frame, then gone. I don't know what to do with that. I've reviewed the footage probably 30 times trying to find an explanation for it, a reflection, a processing artifact, something from outside catching the interior camera lens at an angle that produced an image inside the frame. I haven't been able to construct an explanation that holds up. She was exactly where she'd said she wanted to be. She'd said she was waiting for someone to come get her. I've thought about that a lot over the past year. I still work that station. I still do my end-of-day checks. But I'll be honest with you, I don't look at the south camera feed at night anymore. I do it in the morning with the sun up. I made that decision about a week after this happened, and I haven't changed it. And I told myself it was just to protect my own peace of mind. That's what I told myself. I grew up in a town called Purdue, Alabama, population 800 and falling. It's the kind of place where the Methodist Church is the center of everything, and everybody knows your grandmother's maiden name and what she died of. I left when I was 18 to go to college in Birmingham, and I've lived there ever since. I'm a paralegal. I go back to Purdue maybe twice a year, Thanksgiving, and whenever something pulls me back. 6 years ago, something started pulling me back in a way I couldn't explain. That was when an old woman named Ruby Hollins started calling me on Sunday afternoons. I don't know how she got my number. The first call came in mid-February, a Sunday, around noon. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the area code, but something made me pick up. She introduced herself as Ruby, said she was calling from Purdue, and asked how I was settling in up in Birmingham. She said she'd heard I was doing well and she was glad. I didn't know her. I told her I thought she might have the wrong number. She laughed and said no, she knew who she was calling and she just wanted to check in. The call lasted about 20 minutes. She asked about my work, about whether I was seeing anyone, about whether I'd found a good church. She talked about people in Purdue, names I vaguely recognized from childhood, some I didn't. She was warm, she was sharp. She was nothing like a confused old woman who dialed wrong. She called back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. I kept answering. I don't have a good explanation for why. Partly it was that she was kind, and partly it was that she seemed to genuinely know things about me. Not private things, just general things. The kind of details you'd know if you'd been paying attention from a distance. She knew I'd switched firms. She knew I'd adopted a cat. She knew my mother had been having some health issues, though she never said how she knew any of it. I asked her once, about a year in, how we knew each other. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Honey, I've known you since you were small." And then she changed the subject. I should have pushed harder. I didn't. She called me every Sunday for 6 years. The last call was in March. She sounded the same as always. She asked if I'd been keeping up with my sleep and told me to eat something green every day. She said she'd talk to me next week. She didn't call the following Sunday or the one after that. I told myself she was probably under the weather. The third Sunday I searched her name, Ruby Ann Hollins, 81 of Purdue, Alabama. Died March 22nd. Survived by her daughter and 2 grandchildren. Funeral services had been held the previous Saturday. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to my mother's house and asked to look at her old photo albums. I told her I was feeling nostalgic. She brought out 4 albums from the 70s and 80s. Her wedding, my parents' early years in Purdue, the years before I was born. Ruby Hollins was in the background of my mother's wedding photograph, standing in the second row on the left side of the reception hall, partially behind another guest, looking at the camera. I'd never noticed her before. I'd looked at that photo 100 times. I drove to Purdue the following weekend. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I went to the Methodist church, and I asked the woman at the front desk if there was anyone I could talk to about Ruby Hollins, whether she had family still in town, whether anyone was sorting through her estate. Her granddaughter, a woman named Beth, was at the church that same morning dropping off a food donation. She came out and shook my hand and looked at me for a moment and said, "You're the one from Birmingham, aren't you?" She said her grandmother had talked about me, not often, but consistently, over many years. She said Ruby always mentioned me in the context of checking on me, making sure I was doing all right, making sure I hadn't gotten lost. Beth brought me an envelope. She said Ruby had left it in the care of the church to be given to me specifically when the time came. My name was on the outside in Ruby's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on a birthday card she'd sent me 2 years ago. The envelope was sealed. Beth said it had been left with the church 12 years ago. 12 years ago, I was 22 years old. I'd been gone from Purdue for 4 years. I had a different phone number and lived at 3 different addresses over those 4 years. Ruby Hollins hadn't called me yet. She wouldn't start calling for another 6 years. Inside the envelope was a phone number, my current cell number, the number I've had for 4 years, which I got when I switched carriers. I have no explanation for how that number was in an envelope sealed 12 years ago. I asked Beth how Ruby knew me. Beth said she'd asked her grandmother that once. She said Ruby had told her she used to look after me when I was very small, that she'd known me since before I had memories. I drove home and called my mother. I asked her if we'd ever had anyone named Ruby Hollins babysit me when I was young. She went quiet. My mother is not a woman who goes quiet. She held the silence long enough that I asked if she was still there. She said, "We didn't have babysitters when you were 4. You never left our site that whole year. Something happened that year, and we don't talk about it." I asked what had happened. She said she wasn't going to discuss it on the phone and changed the subject, and we haven't returned to it since. I don't know who Ruby Hollins was to me. I don't know what happened in Purdue when I was 4 years old, the year my mother says I never left her site. I don't know how a phone number that didn't exist 12 years ago was inside a sealed envelope left at a church. I don't know why an 81-year-old woman I have no memory of spent 6 years calling me every Sunday to make sure I was all right. What I do know is that she never got the tone wrong, not once. She called every week like someone checking on a person they were responsible for, like someone making sure I was still there. I keep thinking about that, the way you'd check on someone, specifically if you were afraid of what might happen if you didn't. I drove a long-haul route for 22 years before my knees forced me to retire. After that, I bought 12 acres about 9 miles outside of Hartley, Iowa, and I've been there since. Small operation, some corn, a few head of cattle, more quiet than I probably deserve. My morning routine hasn't changed much from when I was working. Up before 5, out the door by 6, drive the 9 miles into town for a newspaper and a coffee that's better than what I make at home, back on the property by 7:30. To get to town from my place, I go through an intersection about 2 miles down the road where 4 county gravel roads come together. The county's name for it is the CRA 14 Junction. Everybody out here just calls it Four Corners. It's been called that since before I moved here. Flat ground in every direction, no buildings within half a mile, a stop sign on each approach. On a clear day, you can see the intersection from a quarter mile out in any direction. On a foggy morning, you can't. Iowa gets fog in October. Not coastal fog, heavy agricultural fog that rolls out of the fields when the temperature drops and the moisture comes up out of the soil. It sits low, usually 2 or 3 feet off the ground, sometimes higher. On a bad morning, it closes down visibility to maybe 50 yards. I've driven through it my whole life, and I know how to read it. The first foggy morning last October, I slowed down coming into Four Corners like I always do. I came to a full stop at the sign, checked all 4 approaches the best I could through the gray, and started through the intersection. There was someone standing in the middle of it. I hit the brakes hard enough to skid a little on the gravel. I came to a stop, maybe 30 feet from the person. A figure facing north, standing in the center of the intersection where all 4 roads meet, standing perfectly still. I sat in the truck with the engine running. The figure didn't move, didn't turn toward my headlights, just stood there facing north. I gave it maybe 15 seconds, and then I went around. The roads are wide enough at Four Corners that you can go around someone in the center without leaving the gravel. And I did that. As I came around, I got a look at the figure from the side. It was a man, or the shape of one, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see his face because he was still facing north and he never turned. I drove to town, got my coffee, thought about it the whole way there and the whole way back. By the time I came back through Four Corners, the fog had thinned and the intersection was empty. I told myself it was someone out for an early walk. It's unusual, but not impossible. Second foggy morning, 3 days later. Same setup, heavy fog sitting in the fields, visibility poor at the intersection. I came to my stop, looked through the gray. The figure was there again. This time, he wasn't in the center of the intersection. He was at the edge of it, in my lane, about 10 feet past the stop sign where I'd have to drive past him to proceed. Still facing north. Still not moving. I watched him for close to a minute. He didn't shift his weight, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge my headlights. I went around him again, giving myself as much space as the road allowed. In my rearview mirror, the fog closed back behind me and I couldn't see him anymore. I asked my neighbor Earl that afternoon if he'd seen anyone walking the county roads in the early morning. He said no, hadn't seen anyone like that. He asked why. I said I thought I'd seen someone a couple times and wasn't sure they were supposed to be out there in that weather. He said it sounded like old Howard Peel, who used to walk the roads at all hours before his family put him in a care facility 3 years ago. I said maybe that's what it was. Third foggy morning. I almost took the long way around to town. I went through Four Corners because I've been going through Four Corners every morning for 9 years, and I wasn't going to stop because of something I couldn't explain. He was in the intersection again. This time, he was standing directly in the path my truck would take through the intersection. Not at the edge, center of my lane. Not facing north this time, facing me. I came to a stop about 40 feet from him and sat there with the engine running and the headlights on. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see details, just a figure standing in my lane facing my direction. I honked the horn once, long. He didn't react. I'm 62 years old. I've driven professionally for over 2 decades. I don't make poor decisions behind the wheel. What happened next was not a good decision. I drove forward. Slowly, but I drove forward. I don't know what I expected to happen, for him to step aside, for me to see clearly who he was, for this to resolve itself into something normal. Instead, the figure stayed exactly where he was until I was close enough that I could see him clearly through the glass, and I did what anyone would do. I swerved. I went off the gravel to the left and came to a stop in the short grass at the edge of the road, my heart doing something I didn't want to think about too hard. I got out. There was no one in the intersection, no one in the road, no one in the fields, no figure retreating into the fog. I walked to the center of Four Corners and stood where he'd been standing and looked in every direction. Nothing. I drove to town without my coffee and sat in the parking lot of the diner for a while before I went in. I told Sandy, the waitress, I'd nearly had an accident at Four Corners and I was shaken up. She said the fog out there was terrible, and she'd heard someone else say the same thing about that intersection last year. On the way back home, I noticed something I'd missed on the way out. The corn on the west side of the county road, south of Four Corners, was flattened, not wind damage. Corn doesn't flatten that way in the wind. I've seen enough wind damage to know the difference. This was a line of stalks pressed flat, about the width of a person's path, running from the center of the intersection straight south through the cornfield. I pulled over and got out to look at it. The line ran as far back into the field as I could see through the fog. Straight, purposeful. I followed it on foot. My property line is about 2 miles south. The line of flattened corn went straight to it. I tracked it along my fence line until it stopped, at the corner of my yard, 10 feet from my back porch. My porch light was on. It's on a switch on the interior wall. I had not turned it on that morning. The light had been on for 3 mornings. I know that because my son had called me the night before the first foggy morning and asked why the back porch light was on. He'd driven by to check on the cattle and noticed it. I'd told him I must have left it on by accident. That was 3 days before I first saw the figure at Four Corners. I've thought about this every day since October, and I keep coming back to the same thing. The figure was at Four Corners every foggy morning. Not every morning, only foggy mornings. The kind of mornings when visibility at that intersection is maybe 50 yards in any direction. The The kind of morning when you can stand in the center of 4 roads and see everyone coming long before they can see you. The porch light was on before I first saw him, not after. I go through 4 corners every morning. I take the long way on foggy days now. It costs me about 8 minutes. I've been doing it since October, and I don't plan to stop. I've gotten comfortable with not knowing. That's something you either learn or you don't, in a life as long as mine. What I have a harder time getting comfortable with is the direction he was always facing. North, the first 2 mornings. Then the 3rd morning, facing south. South is the direction of my property. 5 stories. 5 people who were on their own property doing their own thing in the middle of nowhere. And it still wasn't enough. If that thought is going to live in your head for a while, it already has a room. Give this video a like, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop a comment telling me which story got under your skin the most. The hunter, the barn, the ranger station, the envelope, or the porch light that nobody turned on. I want to know. For those of you who think a long, dark highway sounds like a more comfortable setting than an empty field, this next one is for you. Spoiler, it isn't. Click now to watch 4 disturbing late-night drive horror stories, because some of these people also thought they were just passing through. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.